evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this evening. It's on the importance of faith in mental health care. My name is Michael Bräutigam, and I'm directing the Center for Theology and Psychology here at Melbourne School of Theology and Eastern College. And this is really the first of a series of webinars this year under the heading Christian Faith in Mental Health. And in a moment, Professor Kuruvilla George, or simply KG, is going to share with us why it is important to include faith in our conversations about mental health care. In the past, we have often separated spirituality from the counseling setting, and especially when done in a secular context, it seems. But today we recognize that it is promising to include spirituality in the therapeutic process. We still have much to learn here, and for this reason, I'm delighted that KG is going to help us navigate through these important issues this evening. Now, Professor KG is a psychiatrist who has served for many years as the Director of Medical Services at the Peter James Center and Wantirna Health, and as Clinical Director of Aged Persons Mental Health and ECT for Eastern Health. KG was also the Deputy Chief Psychiatrist for the state of Victoria between 2002 and 2012, and he currently serves here as Associate Director at our Center for Theology and Psychology. KG's talk will take about an hour or so, and we then have the opportunity to engage in a question and answer session. And if you think of any questions you might have while you're listening, feel free to post them at the bottom at the Q&A box. And you also have the opportunity to support questions, basically to upvote questions. If you find, well, this is exactly my question, you can give your thumbs up and vote it up. And then that gives us an indication of what's really important to you. Now, again, thanks so much for joining us this evening, and I hope you enjoy this session. And without further ado, I'm handing over to Professor KG.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that introduction, and good evening, everyone, one and all. As Michael said, we are very happy that you can join us today for this webinar. As we all know, there's abundant evidence about faith and faith making a difference in healthcare. But we receive minimal training about addressing spiritual needs of patients. And the whole idea of the importance of faith in healthcare might be foreign to many of us because we have had very secular training where no attention is given to the spiritual needs of our patients. At this point, I want to ask you, what's been your personal experience? Just to reflect on that. How much of training did you have in this whole area of faith in your training, whether it's a psychologist, psychiatrist, doctor, occupational therapist, social worker, whatever? How much was there in the way of the importance of faith when it comes to the care of our patients? Now, as Christians, we know and understand, and we know the importance of faith for us personally. We know that. But what about the importance in our profession, in what we are doing? And the time has come, I feel, that we need to rethink this whole area and the impact of faith in healthcare. And today, in the next few minutes, I would like to look on this topic from three aspects. Firstly, why do we need to rethink the role of faith on our practice? Then secondly, what about our practice as Christian healthcare professionals? And then thirdly, how do we give faith more importance in our practice? I mean, we have only an hour or so. We can't go into detail, but I just want to cover these areas as much as we can, and then there's time for question and answer. And for your thoughts as well, and your experiences would be great to hear that. So first of all, uh, uh, why, as I said, sorry, I didn't push the slide to this. This is what I just talked about. So the first question is, why do we need to rethink the role of faith in practice? In Eastern traditions, the concept of spirituality has always been important or incorporated as part of the healing process, whether it be Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Judaism, or the Muslim practice. And throughout much of Western civilization, connections between health and faith were strong. From early civilization until the time of Jesus and all through the medieval period, people would never have thought of separating faith and health. The split occurred between science and religion, and when the split occurred, the trend started to pull faith and health apart. And by I call it the so-called Enlightenment, we say it is enlightenment, but when we look back, many of these things, I know how enlightened have we become. But by the Enlightenment in the late 1600s, that's when we talk about the Enlightenment, and into the modern era from 1600s and into the modern era, Western philosophy thought that spiritual and health concerns should not be mixed in giving patient care. In fact, many considered it wrong for a healthcare professional to speak about faith with a patient. And as a result, what's happened? Religious faith has frequently been ignored. And more than that, like these days, very often felt to have a negative effect on the health of patients. And sometimes people are taken to task for bringing faith into the healthcare domain. And for over a century, the divide has been deepest and widest in the mental health field. Religious beliefs have been considered either neurotic or often inimical to good mental health. Today, scientific research, fortunately, is showing overwhelmingly that the deeper the faith people have and the deeper their religious commitment, the more likely they are to have positive mental and physical health outcomes. And evidence is mounting in this area. Some of the evidence goes back to the 1980s, even though many of us have never heard of it. Of the several hundred studies before 1990, 81% of studies show that for patients who have had a strong faith, it made a real difference to their health. In 15% of studies, there was no effect positively or negatively. And 4% showed a negative effect. And when that was teased out more, why the negative effect, negative outcomes would be due to aspects of faith, very often, such as when someone refuses blood or other treatments for religious reasons. Since the mid 1990s, this is when there's been a mushrooming of research in this area. The interest in the impact of faith on health outcomes has led to a massive amount of research published in journals of medicine, nursing, psychology, sociology, religion, spirituality, pastoral care, chaplaincy, and even in economics and law. And to get a sense of the rapid increase in research discussions on religion, spirituality, and health, here is a breakdown in 6-year periods beginning in 1982. Compared to all published articles during the 80 years between 1902 and 1981, and as reported by Harold Koenig, you can see the breakdown from 1902 to 19, so in 6-year periods. And what you can see in that is that in each of the last 6-year period since the year 2000, there's been more peer-reviewed journal articles on religion, spirituality, and health have appeared than during the entire 80-year period from 1902 to 1981. Now, Hal Koenig from Duke University is recognized as as a world's top expert on religion and health research, and especially as regards mental health. His summary of the research demonstrates that there is a real difference in the health of people who have strong faith, and it affects all areas of our lives. Approximately 80% of research into faith and health involves studies on mental health. Why? Because faith involves psychological, social, and behavioral aspects that relate to one's outlook on life. Faith improves the ability of people to face life-altering circumstances of health with greater inner strength and peace than those who lack spiritual resources. In 344 studies published from 2000 to 2010, an overwhelming majority show that religion or spirituality helped coping with illness and pain, overall life stress, natural disasters, acts of terrorism, diseases such as diabetes, cancer, or HIV/AIDS, heart disease, kidney disease, psychiatric illness, and end-of-life issues. So coping is especially important in chronic illnesses, which, as we know, are more prevalent these days than ever. Whatever, uh, uh, as people are living longer, uh, more and more of these illnesses that we see are becoming chronic. Faith could be considered to give people more positive emotions and to reduce the effect of negative emotions so that it helps with coping. These are observable things for which correlations can be found. Once research established a strong link between faith and positive health outcomes, researchers then turned to other related issues, such as healthy behaviors. Now, healthy behavior greatly impacts prevention, as we all know, and we know that prevention very often is better than cure. And I wish that more of us, in whatever health specialty we are dealing with, we spend more time in the preventive aspects. So healthy behavior, we know, greatly impacts prevention. And that has an effect on the cost of healthcare. And review of the studies from 2000 to 2010 correlating faith and healthy behavior shows that 90% of studies showed more faith correlated with less smoking. 68% of studies found that greater faith correlated. We're not saying it results in it, but this correlation that's found with greater exercise of physical activity. And 52% of studies found significantly lower cholesterol, while 13% reported significantly higher levels. So more and more studies show that stress and negative emotions, like depression or anxiety, have the following effects. It weakens physiological systems, especially for maintaining physical health and healing, increases susceptibility to illness or worsens outcomes for a variety of physical illnesses, and may shorten a person's lifespan. And we all know, I'm sure this is a favorite topic of mine, but we don't have much time, the role of anticipatory stress. How many of us these days, with all the things that are happening, COVID is a perfect example over the past 12 months. The stress that we have about if we go to the shopping center, if we go to the supermarket, or where we are going out somewhere, are we going to get COVID? The stress, or traveling, the stress of that, even though it's not happening, but just thinking about it and worrying about it, we are constantly pouring, having they're saying now impacts on every level, every part of our being, from the brain down to wherever you want to think of. It's having an impact negatively. The role of anticipatory stress. So diseases studied between 2000 and 2010 shows religious or spiritual persons correlate faith and physical health. Sorry, I'll go on to the next one. So other diseases studied have shown, for example, 63% of studies reported that greater faith correlated with less heart disease. 57% reported significantly lower blood pressure. 71% of the studies reported increased immune functions in response to spiritual care. Outcomes when faith is present. And then on an average, 37% had longer lifespans among those who frequently. So when it comes to faith and mental health, research has shown that persons with faith have better mental health. Everything else being equal, if we look at all the other correlations, but if everything else being equal, they cope better with illness. Someone with faith experience less depression and anxiety, much lower rates of alcohol and drug use. And it's also been found that religious-based psychotherapy speeds recovery from depression, bereavement, and generalized anxiety disorder in those with faith. That is, those with faith. We're not talking about people who do not have the faith. Those with severe and persistent disorders involved in religious and spiritual activities cope better with fewer exacerbations. Now, Banali and Koenig in 2013, after a systematic evidence-based review of data, reported good evidence that religious involvement is correlated with better mental health in areas of depression, substance abuse, and suicide. And they found some evidence in stress-related disorders like anxiety and dementia, and insufficient evidence when it came to schizophrenia and bipolar affective disorder. And there were no data for other psychiatric disorders. So that's an interesting, important study that was done, because it was a systematic, evidence-based review of the data that was available. Let me tell you of another very interesting and major study that was carried out by the Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States, with 17,000 volunteers. So it was a major study. And what did it show? It was found that adverse childhood experiences leaves a lasting impact on adult mental health and physical health and development. The 10 adverse childhood experiences include physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, exposure to domestic violence, household substance abuse, household mental illness, parental separation or divorce, and incarcerated household member. These were the 10 adverse childhood experiences that were studied. And the ACE pyramid suggests that adverse childhood experiences results in social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, which in turn results in adoption of health risk behaviors. We all know, like drug addiction or other, sexual behaviors, all kinds of health risk behaviors. It leads that into which then leads into disease, disability, and social problems, resulting in early death. That's the pyramid, the ACE pyramid. Now, Hughes et al. Took this study further. And what did they demonstrate? They demonstrated increased relative risks in adults with 4 or more ACEs. Remember what we talked about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So someone with not just one, if they had 4 of these adverse childhood experiences, what happens is it doubles the risk of heart disease, alcohol misuse, and cancer, tripled the rates of chest diseases and anxiety. There was a 4-fold increase in low life satisfaction and depression. And look at this figure, and a 30-fold increased risk of a suicide attempt. So someone who had 4 or more ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, that's the result of having those experiences. So that was again a major study, Hughes and et al., the study that showed this. Now, these studies do not mention faith, but talk about socio-economic factors leading to the adverse childhood experiences. But as Christians, we can very easily look at the adverse childhood experiences, the factors that are mentioned in the adverse childhood experiences, the 10 that we looked at previously, and see what a difference a child. I'll put that back on to show you, to show what these are. These are the 10. As I said, those do not mention socioeconomic factors. As Christians, we can very easily look at these factors, adverse childhood experiences, and see what a difference a child brought up in a home with faith and Christian values will make to the development of their child. So why include spirituality in patient care? We come to this, the next, why? Faith influences patients even when their healthcare providers do not take faith into consideration. For example, one study found that 66% of patients indicated that religious beliefs would influence their medical decisions. In another study, families and patients ranked faith in God as the second most important factor in treatment. And I can tell you that some studies that we did at the Peter James Center, especially with elderly folks who might be a bit more biased towards faith, we certainly found that in our studies, that faith might not be important to the psychiatrist concerned, but it certainly was important to the majority of patients that we were seeing. So it is therefore important to realize that patients are open and they probably have much more belief and interest in faith than you and I would realize. You know, being made in the image of God, we are each made to know our Creator. Our patients are spiritual, even probably not in an evangelical Christian sense, but they're spiritual. And they may not use religious language to speak about their desire for meaning in life. They might not use languages that we might identify, but it is there. In most, there's a search happening inside of them, even though they do not realize it. And especially when it comes to people who are having illness, and that's why they come to us as healthcare providers, that's a time when many are thinking more about faith, about their life, and about death, about the meaning of life, about eternity. These are times when they think more about that. Now, so based on scientific research, there is, because of all that I was showing you, the scientific evidence that's coming, and it is more every day, there is more and more research that's happening. There is, fortunately, increasing recognition of the importance of faith in healthcare. Many medical colleges in the US and UK are now training medical students to take a spiritual history. An increasing number of professional health practitioner bodies have position statements on spirituality and religion for their members. Uh, for example, the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK, the Royal Australia and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists here in Australia, there's a position statement. And let me tell you, that is one of the MST graduates was a psychiatrist here who has now gone to Hong Kong. Michael Wong was one of the main persons involved. I was involved as well, but he was the main main force behind developing a statement on spirituality and religion, a position statement on spirituality and religion for the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists. So when we are deciding on a treatment plan for a patient very often, I hope we do this. This is expected of us. We consider what is right thing to do for the individual patient. We look at the patient. We don't say, this is your treatment, but we look at the whole patient. What is right for one person might not be the treatment for someone else because of their individual needs, their personalities, their backgrounds, their culture, and so on and so forth. So we consider what is the right thing to do for the individual patient because we need to take the whole person into account when we are making decisions about the best care for each person. We do this in psychiatry. We've got treatment plans for our patients, which are now in Victoria compulsory for every patient. It is a statutory requirement that we do treatment plans for each patient that we see. And so we have to take into consideration of this person. So if we are making these decisions about the best care for each person, should we not include the person's faith, which is an important aspect for a person, which might be important for them, which might not be important for us, but important for the person? So let's give a thought about that. Okay, we can again discuss it further during our times of Q&A and further discussion, and it'd be good to hear your thoughts and about this matter. So then thirdly, just a few quotes. There is a wonderful opportunity for you and me in healthcare as we are helping people physically or emotionally. John Mallinger, he's a well-known physician, cardiologist in US. He said, there is a distance between the pulpit and the pew that is not there at the bedside. And Francis Grimm, who is the founder of the Healthcare Fellowship International, said, more people pass through the hospitals of this world than its churches. That's a very striking quote that we can all think of. More people pass through the hospitals of this world than its churches. If we are waiting for people to come to our churches, it'll be a minority, but we'll be seeing many, many more people that will be going through the hospitals and healthcare systems that we work in. And I've said that Christian healthcare providers are missionaries. That's the way I look at them. And our workplace are our mission field. Can we begin to look at our health, our areas of work as a mission field? So how do we do this? How do we, as Christian healthcare professionals, when we are also more and more increasingly these days faced with antagonism, faced with all kinds of opposition, when we talk about our faith, and we say we are a Christian, we'll probably be persecuted more than any other faith. How do we do this? Yes, I agree. It is becoming more and more difficult. But here are a few things that could help. First of all, we need to be convinced that our patients need Christ. Are we convinced that each of the person that we see, the ultimate healing is when they know Christ? We can patch the body, patch the brain, give them some salve, but the ultimate healing comes from God. Are we convinced of that? I think we need to be, first of all, be convinced of that before we do anything in this area. Otherwise, all that we do will be just to fulfill an obligation because I heard a talk or because somebody has said that we should be witnesses. So I'm going to do something. But are we convinced about it ourselves? Secondly, I would say we should see every patient through the eyes of God and have the same compassion that Jesus had. For example, when we read Mark chapter 2, 1 to 12, example of the healing of the paralytic. Jesus saw the man wanted help. Jesus said, "Do you have faith?" And the man said, "I do." Then out of compassion, Jesus healed the man. So do we see patients with that same, the eyes of Jesus, the eyes of God, and have the same compassion that Jesus had? Thirdly, to be able to facilitate this spiritual uh, part of our care that we can do, and it is a start of a conversation that we can begin to have in this area very often, an opening that can have come is to take a spiritual history at the first opportunity. It does not have to be lengthy. It does not have to be intrusive. And I used to teach all the medical students that came to me and my registrars. And I would say, you know, in psychiatry, we take a huge load of information from patients. We look not only about the current uh, illness that they are having, we talk about their family history, we talk about their social history, we talk about their personal history, going into all kinds of details, into every area of their life. We go into in detail. But this is an area where there is often a big gap where the person has got faith. Now, there are many different ways that we can do a spiritual history. There are many examples that you can find if you go into the literature, but this is a simple one. It's called FICA. And what does it mean? First of all, asking the patient that you see when you're seeing the patient, do you have a faith? And I often used to ask my medical students when I was teaching them, is that intrusive? Is that imposing our values onto someone else? Because often the thing is, if you have got a faith, you should not impose it onto somebody else. Agreed. But just asking someone, do you have a faith? Is that intrusive? I don't think so. And they would say, no, asking whether you have a faith. All right. So if they say, yes, we have a faith, like I said, many do, though they might not express it, but just saying they have a faith. The next question is, how important is faith at this point in your life? How important is it during this illness that you're suffering, this suffering that you're suffering? How important is it? Is that intrusive? Not at all. You're asking how important this thing is for them. You're not imposing your beliefs on them, but just asking that question. The third question is, if they say, yes, it is important, I've been thinking more about my faith and about many issues of life recently, then the next question is, do you have a community? Do you have a group of people, or do you have a person that you can talk to further about this matter? Is that intrusive? Not at all. And then the fourthly is, if the person says, no, I don't, if they say, yes, I do have, then encouraging them to go and have that chat with that person. But if they say, no, we don't have anyone, then that's the address. Then you can ask, would you like me to refer you onto somebody, a chaplaincy person or a pastor, someone who comes to the hospital who is involved with it? Would you like me to refer that person on to somebody? So that's the fika. Simple, doesn't take much time, not intrusive at all, and immediately we get an idea of where this person stands as regards his or her faith. And it's also an opening that's been created without being intrusive at all. I hope that many of us can begin to do that, at least take a spiritual history. Fourthly, conversations as regards faith. We, when we want to then begin to start talking about this issue, if there is an opening and the person seems to be interested in having more conversations, then it should always be with permission, with sensitivity, and with respect. And 1 Peter 3, verse 15 says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and with respect. So we can begin to have conversations, but always be prepared to, with permission, sensitivity, and respect. And when we do that, it's very rare that people are going to complain about what we have done. And these days, it might be good also to make a note in the notes or whatever. This is what I found about the person's faith, and this is uh, a conversation the person was, asking, and this is what I have done. Now, fifthly, we can introduce in our conversation when we are talking to our clients or patients or consumers, whatever word we want to use, we can introduce faith flags and faith stories naturally in conversations. So, what are they? Faith flags are little sort of things that you can just drop a hint in. For example, when you're talking to a patient, a psychiatric patient or your client who's going, you can say, oh, isn't it how wonderful God has created our brain? What a marvelous creation we are. Just introducing that's a faith flag, and see what the reaction or response a person then gives. That's what called faith flags. We can introduce little gems like that during our conversation without being intrusive at all. Faith stories are a bit more. So, probably somebody who is going through anxiety, and then when you're talking to them and saying, I had a similar, with this COVID that was going on, I was getting all stressed out, uh, and feeling very stressed, not being able to see my family, my children, my grandchildren. It was causing me a lot of anxiety and stress. And, my way of trying to deal with it was that I spent a lot of time quietly. I meditated and spent time as regards my faith with God, talking to God. So faith story, to see how to say how personally, or someone that that has gone through a difficulty has found faith of use or help in their suffering or what they are going through. So those are faith stories. So we can introduce faith flags and faith stories. Now, I talk about the 6 C's for spiritual influence in healthcare. First is when we want is to the Christ-like character. Is there something in us that attracts others, our colleagues, our patients, our clients, our consumers? When they look at us, when they deal with us, they immediately say there's something different here about this person compared to the other person that I've been dealing with. The Bible says that we are the aroma of Christ. Christ-like character is seen in the fruit of the Spirit that are listed in Galatians chapter 5, 22, 23. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Do we show that aroma when we are with our clients or with our patients, with our colleagues? Does that come across? That is very often much more a powerful witness about our faith without sometimes even saying a single word. Secondly, professional competence. Now, this is important. we find sometimes Christians who say, well, I'm trying to be a witness, but there is not the same sort of enthusiasm or the same uh, degree of importance given to our professional competence. It's true that many patients are open to discussing spiritual issues, but they still want to receive the best possible health care. And that is why they have come to see us. Not because we are a Christian. Maybe Christians will come to us if they are Christian, but why have they come to us not knowing anything about our faith? Because they want the best health care. And it is important to work with excellence to be a good witness for Christ. Colossians 3:23 says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord and not for human masters. A personal, uh, um, let me just give you a little personal testimony of that I had. When I first came to work at Peter James Center, this is about 22 years ago, as a, at the there was the it was for the clinical director's position in age persons mental health. And at the end of the interview, uh, I don't know how many people will do that these days, or whether I would even do it these days. At the end of the interview panel asked me, okay, KG, is there anything that you would like to ask us, as we usually do at the interview panel? And I said, yes, I do. Would you mind my starting a Christian fellowship, a hospital Christian fellowship at the Peter James Center? They said, oh, by all means, we'd be happy for you to do that. I don't know, again, how many will say that these days in hospitals. But at that time, I think they were so desperate to get a director. And I had built a reputation at my previous work and places in the work that I did, and the quality of the work that I did, that I could be confident enough to say that because of that. So the professional competence that we should be looking for. Thirdly, compassion. This is often a challenge to all of us, to be consistently compassionate with our patients during our busyness, tiredness, difficult patients, and often maybe more than difficult patients, relatives or clients, relatives of clients. Compassion comes from a Greek word which means to be moved from our bowels, because it was felt in the Greek world. Splanchnizomai is the word, that the emotion was seated in the bowels. So compassion comes from a Greek word which means to be moved from within our bowels. The bowels were thought to be the seat of emotion. Sympathy is to feel sorry for. Empathy is to suffer with, while compassion is to suffer with and to do something about it. Mark chapter 1, verse 42 to 42, how Jesus was moved with compassion and touched. He felt that compassion and he did something about it. Otherwise, it's just empathy. People do not care how much you know until they know how much you care. Now, this is a key, the compassion, and this is where many in the secular world are lacking. Many in Australia, yes, because of the Christian influence might be there, but it's going, I'll tell you, disappearing. And this is where we can shine forth as compassionate people. There's been a lot written up in UK, for example, about compassion. The need for compassion, they're talking about it in medical schools. They have to teach compassion because it's not there now naturally in people, even those who have decided to do the healing profession. They have to be taught. So can we, because of the example that Jesus Christ has given us, be that compassionate person? Fourthly, wise communication. Communication, as we know, is done in so many ways. And we know when we study communication that 70% of communication comes through non-verbal ways, not with the words that we say. When a patient comes to us as a GP or a doctor, are we, rather than giving full eye contact, sitting there writing, it shows how much interest we have in that person. When I took history very often of my patients, I would not write it while they are talking. I would write it later on. I mean, fortunately, as a psychiatrist, I had probably more time than general practitioners would do or others would do. But to give them that full attention and the eye-to-eye contact, that our non-verbal communication that we are giving to patients, that we do care, we give importance to what they are saying. So listening is a very important part, as we know, of communication. And asking wise questions, just asking little questions, is another great tool in dealing with people. Proverbs 15:2 says, "The tongue of the wise makes knowledge acceptable." The tongue of the wise makes knowledge acceptable. And I talk about the example that we find in about the prophet Elijah, when he was going through a period of a meltdown, and how God dealt with him. And God did not bombard him with all kinds of spiritual things, but he asked him very, very specific questions. And God uh, then got Elijah going again. Now, wise communication. Fifthly, commitment. We need to be really committed to the fact that as Christian healthcare professionals, we have a calling as regards faith in healthcare situations. Unfortunately, as I said, because of our secular training and the influence that has been there in Australia, you know, I worked in UK, I've worked in India, I was born and brought up in Singapore. I find Australia the most difficult place of all these places to talk about faith matters or spiritual matters. You can go into the staff room and people will be talking about everything under the sun, even about their most intimate details, but nowhere will be talking about their faith. It's very so we are in that kind of climate. So we need to be really committed to the fact, as Christian healthcare professionals, we have a calling as regards faith in healthcare situations. Commitment separates dreamers and talkers from doers. Paul's example and exhortation to all believers in Romans 1 to 8, we can read. And he says himself, "I'm called as a bond servant and set apart for the gospel." Do we feel that commitment? And sixthly, courage. Spiritual influence requires that we have courage. God wants us to have a spirit of boldness and courage and to be free from anxiety and fear, which are the opposite of what faith produces in us. Joshua 1:9 said, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid and do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." And finally, let me say, prayer should undergird all our activity. And remember that as Christians, we have the Holy Spirit indwelling in us and working in all our interactions with our patients and colleagues. So even when we are not saying anything, remember that we have a Holy Spirit indwelling in us as Christians, and there is that influence that is happening. Acts 1:8 says, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea, and to the ends of the earth." Now, Harold Koenig has said there is every reason to think that faith is important in healthcare. After all the studies that he has done, as I said, he is probably the most widely, most wide researcher in this area of faith. There is every reason to think that faith is important in healthcare. And David Larson is someone who worked with him, his colleague. He says, "If faith were a pill, I would give it to every patient, as it has the highest number of positive impacts with the fewest negative side effects." Certainly, in psychiatry, as I came to the end of my career, I realized more and more that the amount of poisons that we put into our patients uh, and I began to give less and less medication because of the side effects very often that we are creating. So if faith were a pill, I would give it to every patient, as it has the highest number of positive impacts with the fewest negative side effects. God is the therapist. I am privileged to be the co-therapist with God. God is a therapist. Let's remember all the time. I am just the co-therapist. And thank God that I have been called to this privilege in a healthcare profession. Is a special privilege that we have as healthcare practitioners. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Thank you so much, KG, for this stimulating presentation. You've really given us much food for thought, and there are a few questions coming in. And maybe let me start with one I thought about when I listened to you, KG. You mentioned prevention, and I think that's a very important point that you made there, that we need to look more carefully at prevention of mental health problems. What can we do in order to prevent mental health issues as believers in the church? Do you have any ideas, any creative ideas?
Yep, we need to be careful about that, because very often when Christians talk about it, they're talking about if you have more faith, you won't suffer from mental illness, or you're suffering from mental illness because of a lack of faith or because of your personal sin. You're suffering from mental illness. Uh, we need to be careful about that. Again, studies have shown that faith does not, especially I'm talking here about the serious mental illness, faith does not prevent people from suffering from mental illness, but it helps in the recovery. And it's the same with many of the physical illnesses. But here's the big but. Just like physical illnesses, we are understanding more that there are things that we can do in the way of looking after our bodies, and that's the exercise, about diet, about many of the good lifestyle factors. We know there's no doubt now about smoking, drug taking, and alcohol intake, excessive, all that we know. So similarly, when it comes to emotional problems, again, many of these things that we talk about in the physical area, about a good physical uh, health, having taking care of your physical fitness, your diet, uh, etc., also has impact on your emotional well-being. So all these lifestyle factors are important in prevention, and certainly faith does play a part, especially when we talk about it might not, as I said, prevent it. A person who has got personality of being anxious because of your upbringing that has been there, you are more it doesn't stop anxiety, but it probably helps us in coping with the anxiety if you have the faith and the religious tools that we can develop and have.
Thank you so much, KG. Now over to you all and your questions to KG. Here is the first question, KG. Someone wants to know, do you have any advice, KG, on how to handle things when your patient population overlaps with your church community? So apparently when you have someone from your church in your counseling setting, what is that? What do you say to that, KG?
So if a person from the church, the thing is, I mean, normally we say that it's not a good principle to be treating someone that you're very close with, isn't it? I mean, sometimes it's difficult to keep yourself objective. So it might be good if you have someone, uh, again, it depends on what. If you're talking about psychological issues, maybe less when it comes to physical issues. Even there we need to be wise about that. The importance is how close you are to that person, um, because it begins to, I think it becomes difficult to probably keep some of the things more objective when you are close to that person. So it might be better to hand it over to somebody that that you feel that you can, with confidence, look after that person.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say. But I don't see any reason why someone from the church community can't be treated. For example, we know a GP who is a Christian, or a psychologist who's a Christian, a counselor, Christian counselor. There's no reason at all. I think in very often it might be a good thing.
Thanks so much. That's helpful, KG. Thank you. Now, the next question here, someone wants to know whether you have any suggestions on how to use spirituality in dealing with non-Christians or those of other faiths. So what would you do as a Christian then?
Well, that's where the talk that I was giving was probably geared towards that, and how we can begin to have openings to begin to open up conversations about faith. And the first thing, as I would say, would be to, if you have not been in so far taking a spiritual history or a faith history, is to begin with that. And that itself might create openings about further discussions and that you can have. Always being careful that you're not trying to impose your beliefs on that person, but you can begin to have conversations. And when it comes to the point where you feel this might interfere in my relationship, this person is asking questions more, that we might have to then pass it on to people that could do it rather than be taking it down ourselves. But certainly beginning to have that conversation, as I was saying, we're taking the history, the faith flags, faith stories, beginning to have, listening to them, very often asking very pertinent questions. Some of these things begin to come out.
Thanks, KG. It's really working well here with the voting system. So questions are being upvoted, and that's great. Here is the next question. And this person says, I'm a psychology student. Say I'm seeing a Christian client. How can I integrate psychological practice with the Christian faith? So maybe more like a practical question here. How do you actually do that?
So I would see less of a problem if a person is a Christian and has got a Christian faith, and you are a Christian. You can always have the conversation with them, and I presume they'll be quite happy, and probably they've come to see you because knowing that you are a Christian psychologist, and so it'd be less of a problem talking about faith issues, and talking about when you're talking about therapy as well. There are Christian oriented cognitive therapy and things that we can use, as I mentioned, about even family therapy, psychological therapies with a Christian viewpoint that can be more meaningful to that patient and useful.
Great.
And that problem, yeah.
And that also covers another comment here by a participant who says he's a registered counselor with PACFA and CCAA, who markets himself really as deliberately as a Christian counselor and encourages others to do that as well. So I notice that too. Thanks for that, KG. Now here's an interesting question. I'm going to read it out to you. What is your opinion about the movement away from CBT to the plethora of third wave approaches such as DBT and ACT, which contain explicit content in relation to mindfulness, acceptance, values, and so forth, that are broadly inclusive of faith?
Yeah. So look, I'm not an expert in this area. As a psychiatrist, I would probably defer it to a psychologist to answer that. Michael, can you, your views on that?
I just remember that we talked about a similar issue last year when we did the Christian mindfulness webinar, if I remember correctly, where you were quite, where we agreed that, well, as long as it doesn't really contradict with our Christian values, we could be quite inclusive and really focus on that. But yeah, that's, and I'm not that familiar with DBT and ACT, so I wouldn't really know. I don't have much to say here, unfortunately. But that's really maybe something to follow up, and maybe we could deal with that in a more specific webinar at a different stage.
Yeah, I mean, and also to say that the Center for Theology and Psychology, we want to do more in this space, in this area, and to be able to then also teach and train more church and Christians about these areas.
So it's work in progress. Yes.
Yep.
Thanks, KG. Here's a question. Do you have, wait a minute, health issues? That's really for courses. That's what we're going to do. Maybe we type an answer here. Here's another question. How much of the benefits of faith are due to either better health behaviors and decreased stress from social supports and relationships in the faith community? This person has read that the benefits are not fully attributed to better health behaviors or social relationships.
Yep, a good question. So that's why it says correlation rather than a definite, this faith is causing this. That's a correlation. And the correlation, as has been raised, could be due to better health benefits. The lifestyle factors, certainly the community and support that we get from our Christian community, families that we are probably, the family lives that we have, and spiritual and the principles that we live with, certainly, I think, probably contributes a great deal when it comes to mental health and emotional well-being. So that's why many of the studies are not this is causatory, but it's more correlation that's been found.
Yeah, that's important. Thanks, KG. Now, another participant wants to know whether many of these studies that you mentioned, KG, did they differentiate between the different faiths and their effects on health outcomes? Because you mentioned faith, but what kinds of faiths were included?
So a lot of the studies were about, there are studies about religiosity and spirituality. And there are some that distinguish between the different denominations and different, Christian denominations, different religions. But overall, what I mentioned is about faith as a whole, rather than breaking it down to different religions. Anybody who has a faith, whether it be whatever faith it is, seems to do better than someone who doesn't have any faith.
Thank you. Thanks, KG. And how would you handle a client who struggles with faith issues as a trigger resulting in a psychiatric or psychological presentation? Will the primary principle of management be faith-based or medically psychiatric?
So it very much depends. I mean, this is where it becomes difficult to talk definitely, because it depends very much on the patient, the diagnosis of the patient, what exactly the patient is going through, because as we know, there will be psychiatric illnesses where even a person who is psychotic could be expressing delusions which have a religious content, but in those kind of areas, there is no point in talking about spirituality and or faith matters there, because what the person is suffering from is a psychotic illness that needs treatment. So it all depends on the illness, I would say, and in the way of or the treatment that has to be given.
Thanks, KG. So many questions here. There's another question, and where the participant asks, can you suggest some practical ways to weave the faith into supporting adult children or children? Or is it just a matter of implementing the 6 C's?
You're talking about bringing up children?
Or how do you, it's very general. Can you suggest some practical ways to weave the faith into supporting children who are suffering from mental health issues, maybe adult children who are suffering from mental health issues? How would you do that?
Yeah. I'm just thinking what might be so the 6 C's that I gave you was generally for us as healthcare practitioners when we're dealing with patients. If we are talking about, again, as you know, there are so many books these days you can get hold of about parenting, right parenting, how, what are the right values to inculcate in children. There'll be so many things. That is not my expertise, but we can certainly get hold of many books and resources in that area.
Thanks. Here's a longer question, and I'm going to read it out to you. As a counselor, when a client of another faith, like Islam or Hinduism, comes to me and talks of how her faith helps her, I usually affirm her in her beliefs. But then would it be appropriate for me to talk about my faith as a Christian? There are times, because they are aware of my beliefs, they may say, would you pray for me? But my question is, do I gently push my faith or simply ask about how her faith helps her in her current situation? Really fascinating question here.
Yes. So, that's a good question. I mean, I think certainly if the person is talking about their faith, we try to encourage that person in that faith. But if there are opportunities that arise, without being intrusive, we introduce about the way that we what I believe, and if the patient is accepting of that, I mean, wants to talk about it, there's no reason why we can't. It's the question is that we're not seen to be intrusive and pushing our beliefs onto that person. If the person is opening up, talking about their faith and asking you, what about you, what's your faith, what are your beliefs, there's no reason why we can't do that. I mean, the one important thing though is, even when it comes to prayer, there have been lots of people who have been brought to task, doctors who have been brought to task because they have prayed with their patients. But I would say that if somebody is asking you to pray, that you can do that, but as long as I would suggest document it. Documentation is very important. So the patient requested, and if you feel able to do it, do that. Otherwise, we can say this is where referring on to a pastoral care worker or a chaplain in the hospital or clinic to be able to do that.
Thanks, KG. That's very helpful. And here's another really fascinating question, because you mentioned the growth of interest and research into the importance of faith in mental health care. You've shown us this slide. And here this person wants to know how, this is interesting because generally faith seems to be less and less relevant in the Western world, but still you have this increase in the research that you mentioned. Can you, what do you think about that? That's interesting.
I mean, research, obviously, there has been more people who have been interested in this area and doing research. So that's why there's been all the publications about that. And when we say that people are less interested in faith, this is where it becomes probably interesting, in that we think that's the case, but people might not be willing to probably talk about it. But when you are, you'll find that there are people. How many people would you say that you have come across who will say, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God at all? You know, they have got some faith or other. It might be faith in the supernatural, it might be faith about the forces in the world, or faith in something else. They do have some spirituality. There are very few people who say, you know, I'm totally devoid of any faith. It might be that we have increasingly in the West, people are turning away from the Christian faith, but faith as a whole, I don't think there has been a lessening of that in people, because people have a need to be connected to something supernatural, something a God or something supreme.
We might not be that secular after all. It's a fascinating phenomenon. Yeah. Thank you for that, KG, and great question again here. Now, next question, might we suggest that a person's spiritual history can be taken within the wider rubric of inquiring after a person's resources more broadly?
Yes, as part of that, we can take a spiritual history. Yeah.
Great, short answer. And here is another question. The studies, and similar to what we just talked about, now many studies that you mentioned have been conducted in Western settings where we have a heritage of Christianity. Are you aware of any studies in other contexts? Have you looked at that at all?
Most of the literature, you're right, that a lot of the research that's been done by Koenig has been in the Western sphere. I won't be able to answer that. I mean, so how much studies have been done in the East or in other cultures, I'm not very aware of.
Thanks. Another participant is more like a comment, but maybe you can say briefly something here. The person mentions that sometimes people feel pressure from religious leaders on their faith, and it works adversely to their mental health. So it has a negative impact on mental health. What do you think about that? I mean, it's more like a observation, really.
Yeah.
And that's, this is why it's so important to balance, and that's why we do theology and psychology, both.
Yeah. So I presume the person is saying, again, what I already mentioned, that very often it's mentioned it's due to your lack of faith that you're suffering from all these problems that you are having. So that, it comes from, I would say, what's called the docetic view or docetism. That's where it comes from, where we're thought to be supernatural. We are not. We are human beings made with emotions. We have emotion. Being emotional is not sin. Having anxiety is not sin. It's not due to a poor faith, but it's how we manage it. There are going to be anxiety provoking situations every day in our life, more so. So we can't say that it's not going to be there, but it's how we cope with that that is more important than saying that we're not going to be anxious altogether. Or sad. We are going to have periods of sadness and depression.
Thanks, KG. And you really have touched on this before. I think maybe just a brief answer here. What do we do if the patient answers us they have another faith? So they're non-Christians.
Yep, that's fine. Yeah, we are not there trying to force them into our faith. That's where the problems come, that we are seen to be trying to push our faith onto our patient or client. That's when the problems begin to have. We can begin to have this discussion, and hopefully that will open the person to know more about what we are want to share, but we are not there to push our faith on somebody else.
Great, thanks. And here's a question where I think I see what is meant here. So this person is interested, would you recommend a Christian who suffers from a mental illness to see a Christian psychologist and psychiatrist? And I think the emphasis here on the Christian, a Christian, distinctly Christian psychologist / psychiatrist, or a non-Christian or secular, or what do you think?
Yeah, it again depends very much on, I would say, the illness that the person is suffering from. For example, if a person is suffering from one of the major mental illnesses, or what you call the severe mental illness, like schizophrenia or bipolar affective disorder or dementia, for example, it doesn't make any difference whether you're seeing a Christian or a non-Christian. The treatment would be very, very similar that's going to be given. And let me tell you that after all these years of experience that I've had as a psychiatrist, that I've come across very few. There'll be many psychiatrists who are non-Christians, but very few who would that I have come across. Maybe one or two who would be very antagonistic, because we are taught in our training not to impose again our beliefs onto somebody else, and to respect the belief or faith that someone else has. So they're not there to say that you're wrong. They might not talk very much about it, but no one is going to negate that you have your faith, and they have been taught to respect your faith.
Thanks, KG. Can you still go a little bit further, or how are you feeling? You've already answered 20 questions.
Oh, that's all right. That's
You're
fine.
fine?
So I mean, yeah, and so when we talk about the less, so the high prevalence, this mental as you know, mental disorders like anxiety, uh, depression, etc. Probably there might be a point that uh, it might be good if you seek the help of. There are so many now Christian
Mm.
psychologists and counselors that are available. It might be good to seek their assistance, I would say.
Yeah, and we saw an earlier comment here in the Q&A box where a Christian counselor encouraged us to really explicitly advertise your services as Christian counseling. Yeah, that's probably a good point.
Yeah.
Now, let me just see what's the next one. Here's a really foundational one. Impossible to answer in a few sentences, but you can give it a try. How can we explain mental problems from a Christian worldview?
Mental problems from a Christian worldview. Yeah. So as I think, yeah, that's that was the topic of the last webinar that I gave. If you want to listen to that, you're most welcome. That Christians are not immune to mental illness. We are all, because of the original sin, we are all vulnerable to physical illnesses and similarly to mental illnesses. So just because we are Christians doesn't mean that we do not suffer from schizophrenia or bipolar affective disorder or anxiety or dementia. It's not going to prevent us from suffering from those. But certainly it'll help in our recovery if we have a faith. Uh, and so when we talk about the Christian worldview and illnesses, all illnesses we know has been a result of sin, and uh, it is not particularly because we are more sinful that we have psychiatric disorders, or because we have got lack of faith we suffer from psychiatric disorders or emotional problems. That is uh, not, unfortunately, that's the stigma and the wrong teaching that has been there over the years that we have to try. And that's one of the major things that we, as a center of psychology and theology and psychology, want to try and help Christians and the churches to get over.
Exactly. And if you want to hear more, we are currently running a unit. It's called Theological Approaches to Mental Health, where we exactly deal with these questions. And it runs every year. So have a look at our website, and you can always audit these courses as well, these units where you can just drop by and learn these things. Now, that's great. Next question. How do you teach a patient to deal with suppressed emotional pain in a spiritual setting? Do you pray with them if they're open to that?
Yes, I mean, you have to be very careful about that. As I said, many practitioners have been brought to task for praying with patients. But if there is that openness, and if the person is asking for it, you're not pushing it. If the patient is asking for it, then I don't see any reason why you can't. I have prayed with patients uh, where there has been that request when they have known that I'm a Christian, and they've said, "Doctor, would you pray with me?" I have done it with the understanding of the patient and the acceptance of the patient. But we don't use that prayer as a tool with all patients that we see, all clients that we see. That's when we begin to hit problems and difficulties.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I have to say about prayer is, we don't have to always pray with a person. We can pray for a person. And God is going to hear our prayers, whether we pray with the person or we pray for the person. And I used to say to many of my Christian colleagues, when you're walking, you don't have to even meet as a group. When you're walking down the corridors of the wards, we can be praying for the patients that you see, or the colleagues that are working with you. There's nothing stopping or hindering us from doing that silent prayer as we are walking, and God hears us equally whether we pray loud or we pray quietly.
Thanks. That's a great reminder. Thank you, KG. Now, someone else wants to know here, what would you recommend to a Christian who hasn't got any medical training or background when approaching friends with mental health issues? Should they just refer the friends to the doctor or psychologist, counselor? What should or should not be said? So that is an interesting question here.
Yep, certainly. I mean, I think that is again one of the things that we would like to uh, uh, to teach Christians. One about some of the wrong teachings, how we have got into that about when it comes to mental illness. But then, second thing, or another main area is what can we do as non-professionals? Not if you're not a psychiatrist, psychologist, etc. What can we do as a Christian when we meet people with mental illness or emotional problems? What can we do? So one of the, can I just mention, one of the things that we are thinking about developing is, I think many of you have heard of mental health first aid courses that have become widely accepted now. It started in Melbourne, has gone all over the world, what's called mental health first aid courses for lay people. When they meet people with mental illness, what can they do? How can they help? And we would like to probably develop something similar as a Christian mental health first aid course. We would appreciate your prayers in that project enterprise.
Yeah, and that's such a great reminder that there's this overlap between, there's pastoral care and then there's professional counseling, but everyone plays a role in a person's life suffering from mental health issues, or even just a friend. So it's a communal endeavor when we deal with mental health issues. Such a great reminder. Thanks for that question here. Yes. Another person wants to know, I work with young people who frequently don't have a faith, but some are exploring spirituality. How do you recommend responding here? Quite a broad question. Yeah, what could you do? Yeah,
so if somebody is exploring, again, as we discussed in the talk, is to probably be able to open up the conversation, if at all possible, at least intrusively. And then again, with young people, we have to be extremely cautious so that the parents or others don't come and say, you're influencing my child in these areas. So, but you can certainly then talk to the parents, if there are parents, and say, this has come up, would you like further assistance or help in this area? I know someone I can refer on to who could talk about these matters rather than you doing it probably personally, which could maybe interfere with the relationship or the therapy.
Thanks so much, KG. Maybe a couple of more questions, and then we're done. 26 questions so far. I think it's a new record. Now, one person wants to know, I have often wondered to what extent the demonic plays into mental illness. Are there any resources, authors you recommend who deal with this topic well?
Yes, well, that's another big topic. If we start talking about it now, it will take half an hour at least. So certainly there are, and Michael has already mentioned about the module that that's being taught at CTP, and one of the topics would be about demon possession and demon oppression. Am I right, Michael?
Yes, and we just had a topic last week actually, but Dr. Mark Durie is the lecturer that we've invited for this particular session. And you can look him up, Dr. Mark Durie, D-U-R-I-E. And I'm sure he's got resources online as well. But again, if you want to hear more, get in touch, send me an email, and I'll connect you if you have more specific questions. But he's really an expert in the field, and he will be able to say much more. Maybe one more question, or maybe two. Have you seen faith helping people within the autistic spectrum? Interesting question.
No, it's not my specialty. I'm more of a geriatric psychiatrist. There's the other end of the spectrum. So I've not seen many people with the autistic spectrum disorder. in my practice.
Yes. Could you recommend on the significant prevalence of depression, burnout amongst full-time ministry staff? Yes. And what we can do as Christians and mental health workers about this? Such an important question here.
Yeah, Michael, and there are a lot of resources. I mean, let me give you a few, which I'm working through myself, because we're working on this, as I said, Christian mental health first aid course. This is called the Worry Book, Finding a Path to Freedom. Christians get depressed too. David Murray. Toward a Theology of Psychological Disorder, Marcia Webb. Tackling Mental Illness Together, Alan Thomas, a professor in Newcastle, where he was actually a student when I was training there. So there are lots of books. There's some more, but some for you to, there's loads of that. And we could probably, again, one of the roles that we could play as a Center for Theology and Psychology is to be putting resources up like that for people to get hold of.
Yes, we actually do have a bibliography list, so feel free to get in touch, send us an email, and we'll send you a list with books that we can recommend to you. Now, yeah, I think that's plenty of questions for now, and we have more webinars coming up. But at this stage, please allow me to thank Professor KG so much for both your talk and then also the way you've answered all these questions. That's been really fantastic. Thank you so much for this whole conversation, KG, and really everyone joining us this evening. Thank you for dropping by, and I hope you enjoyed this whole webinar as much as I did. And make sure you visit our website. There are more resources available, and we plan to put out more material in the future. And allow me to mention just a few more things. Our next actually face-to-face meeting, live face workshop is on the 22nd of May with Dr. Sunny Philip, and he speaks about becoming an agent of healing, and the registration is now open on our website. We only have a limited number of participants, so please have a look at that, and the early bird registration is open. You can also register for our next unit that we mentioned within this graduate certificate program of pastoral care for mental health. And this next unit, next semester, is called Theological Approaches to Well-Being. That's an exciting unit. And we're also accepting expressions of interest for next year's Thriving Christian Leaders program. It's 5 sessions per year with group meetings in between the sessions, and it's a wonderful thing to do. And there's so much more information on our website. This has been a free webinar. You didn't have to pay anything, but if you would like to support these sort of webinars for the future, then you're more than welcome to make a donation. We have a little donation button on our website, and yeah, just feel free to check it out so that we could offer free webinars as well in the future. Well, thanks so much again for joining us. Thanks to KG and to all our tech people in the background. Thanks to Lisa, Chris and Greg, and wonderful job, and have a lovely evening. Thank you. God bless you, and goodbye.